Finally, we come to the sixth and final principle of learning to fish like Jesus. And it's this, number 6. Fish for the kind of fish that you can best reach. Fish for the kind of fish that you personally, can best reach. Now, you want to go after those who you're most likely to reach. This is not something I made up. This is a basic New Testament strategy. That you go after the people closest to you. You go after the people you're most related to. You go after the people you have the best relationships with. It's all through the New Testament. Who's Andrew go get? He go gets his brother Peter. Well, it's relation. It's who he could best reach. Who does Matthew go get? He goes and throws a party for tax collectors because he's a tax collector, and he knows all the tax collectors. So Andrew brings his brother. Matthew brings tax collectors. The woman at the well brought the whole village because she knew everybody in the literal sense, okay? Who can you best reach? Now, let's just have a frank discussion here for a minute. Your church is best suited to reach certain kinds of people. And it's just easier for you to reach certain people than it is for you to reach other kinds of people. And that's why we need all kinds of churches. Because God made us with a million different differences and personalities and preferences and styles and, what you need. The example is music. And some people to get in contact with God, they need a very slow, low, quiet, liturgical service where it's all planned out. There's nothing wrong with that. And it's meditative, and they love the order, and the order helps them get in contact with God. And in those kind of services, you don't sneeze unless it's in the program. It's just there. Then there are people at the other end who says, man, they're not feeling God unless they can be running in the aisles. And they're jumping up and down and shouting and having a good time and all of that. And then everybody else is somewhere in between those. It's like the woman who came to church here in the area, and in the middle of the service, she shouted out, "Praise the Lord." And the usher came up and said, "Ma'am, you're going to have to be quiet." And then later on, there was another really good point of pastor. She goes, "Amen, hallelujah." And the usher came up and said, "Ma'am, you're going to have to be quiet." And finally, she had another one. The guy, pastor, was preaching. She really liked it. Said, "Glory to God." And he said, "Ma'am, if you don't have to be, if you can't be quiet, you're going to have to leave." She said, "Well, I'm just so full of the joy of the Lord." He said, "Well, you didn't get it here." I'm going to steal something from the next session, but I don't know if you have a choir in your church. We don't, but if you have a choir, I would recommend that you remove them. Don't let them sit behind the pastor, because the pastor may be up there preaching his heart out like this, and back there, guys, like that, I remember talking to Jerry Falwell one time years and years ago, and he said that there was a guy in his choir who had literally a heart attack and died on the scene, and rigor mortis set in, and he went frozen. They pulled out half the choir before they found the right person. It's late in the day. Okay, all right. God made us with a million different kinds of personal preferences, so how do you know who your church can best reach? Who's most receptive? How do you know who you can best reach? You want to ask these 2 questions. Write these down. These are facts that I've learned about determining your most receptive people groups, who your church can reach. Number 1, first question to ask: what kind of people already attend our church? You go, "Oh, thank you, Rick. Oh, brother, we're in trouble." When a visitor first walks into your service, do you realize that the first question a visitor asks when he walks into your service is not a theological question? Somebody walks into your church, first question is not, do they believe in Jesus here? Do they believe the Bible here? What's their doctrinal statement? They're not asking that question if they're an unbeliever. When an unbeliever walks into your worship center, the very first question they ask is this: is there anybody else here like me? And they're looking around. And, teenager walks in. Any other teenagers in here? A military guy with a military haircut walks in. Anybody else here in the military? Elderly person walks in. Anybody else here got gray hair? A couple with a stroller walking. Any other strollers in this room? A Vietnamese person walks in. Any other Vietnamese in this room? Any other Asians in this room? It is a natural thing when you walk in the room, the first thing you go is, anybody here like me? And if they find someone like them, then there is a likelihood they will stay. Or if they find enough diversity that, okay, this is okay for me here. If they don't, it's not real likely that they will stay. A single walks in. Is everybody here married? Any other singles adults in this church? You look for the people like you. That is a sociological fact. So you have to know, well, what kind of people are already attending our church? I mean, what's the likelihood of a church of retirees in attracting teenagers? Possible, but not probable. What is the likelihood of a church of military personnel in reaching peace activists? Possible, but not probable. What is the likelihood of a person from Thailand, a Thai person, walking in and being reached by a church that's 100% Hispanic? Possible, but not probable. What is the likelihood of a church full of factory workers in reaching a white-collar executive? Possible, but not probable. The point is this: you got to understand your culture of your church. You're more likely to reach those you've already got. I'll explain to you what to do if you don't like what you got in a minute. Hold on. Maybe I'll just hold out to tomorrow to make sure you come back. But the first kind of question, you just have to honestly say, who do we already have? You're most likely to reach more of what you've got. Okay, that's just a fact. We'll talk about it, the implications of the second. The second question you ask is this: what kind of person am I? You, the leader, as a volunteer, as a staff member, as a pastor, as a church leader. What kind of person am I? That's an important question to ask, because God has uniquely prepared you to reach certain people that I will never be able to reach, and vice versa. Your temperament, your personality, you're going to reach certain people easier than me. Your background, even your language, your experiences, none of these things are an accident. God doesn't want you to be anybody else. He wants you to be you. And so you ask yourself, what kind of person do I naturally relate to? And you do some self-analysis. And that's really important to ask, what kind of person am I? And here's a couple facts. Write these down. I can best reach the people that I can relate to. I can best reach the people that I can relate to. The easiest people for you to reach are those who are most like you. And you are, your background, your temperament, your experiences, your greatest contribution will be where you match your target. Let me give you an example. Years ago when I was a teenager, I was an interim pastor of a little tiny church out near Banning, California. It's out where the desert's getting ready to start. And this was a church. The building was smaller than this stage. And there were maybe half the size of the stage. And but it had a giant parking lot that was about 3 times as big as this part of the worship center. And there were maybe about 50, 60 people in it. And I was this young college student pastoring this church. And I trying to figure out, what do they all have in common? And I found out the day that Sunday came around and everybody rolled up. Everybody in that church was a professional trucker. And they drove their rigs to church. And so you go out in the front, there were Kenworths and there were Macs, and they're beautiful, beautiful, $150,000 at that time, trucks. And the parking lot there were no stripes. It's wherever you want to park, man, you know. And everybody in that church was a professional truck driver. Now, they loved me, and they were so good to this little preacher boy, and my sermon sucked. It was terrible. I didn't know how to preach my way out of a paper bag, and I was trying to, but I loved those people. I loved them, and they loved me, and they were good to me. But we didn't match. Why? Because I don't have a mechanical DNA gene in my body. I couldn't repair a carburetor if I had to, okay? I'm just not good at all with anything mechanical. I never have been. I never will be. I'm not wired or shaped in mechanical ways. And so they loved me, but I eventually resigned because I said, you know what, you guys need to get a pastor who's got a little grease under his fingernails and who after the service can lay down under the truck and look up there and say, well, we need to change this. I said, I don't even know what to call it, much less know how to change it. And so while I was a good person and I loved them and they were good people and they loved me, we did not match. Does that make sense? And so I just was never going to take that church to any level of greatness because I didn't match the people. What kind of person am I? I can best reach the people I can relate to, and your greatest contribution will be people that you match with. And then the second thing you need to know is this: you will attract what you are, not what you want. You'll attract what you are as a leader, not what you want. I had a guy who was on our staff many, many years ago, dear man, ex-military, who was in charge of all of our Sunday school and small groups at one point. And he was retired, and one day he just really got a heart for helping Generation X, the baby busters. And he decided that he was going to go to Phoenix and start a church for baby busters. I said, Earl, you're 65 years old. It may have been 67. I said, what do you have in common with baby busters? Well, nothing, I just love them. Well, that's good. But Earl, that's not going to work. I just feel I got to do it. So he did. And the church lasted about 3 months because he in no way matched the kind of people that he was trying to reach. Now, the only exception to this is when you have the missionary gift. And in the missionary gift, you have the ability to work cross-culturally. I have seen some people who were raised in rural areas who can work in urban settings, but it's pretty rare. And I have seen some people who were raised in urban settings who can work in the rural countryside, but that's pretty rare. You're best going to reach, God did not waste your background. It's not a waste. It's not a mistake. You're going to best reach who's like you. When I started Saddleback, I was 25 years old, and we didn't have anybody, hardly at all, that was above 32, 33 years of age when we started the church, until I added Glenn Cruin. Glenn Cruin was my second staff member, and Glenn was about 10 years older than me. And so when I was, I think, 25, he was 35. And so he was the old man in the church. And all of a sudden, we started reaching people closer to his age and a little bit older. They said, okay, there are at least some adults in this church. And pastor may still have pimples, but, we trust this guy. He's 35, nearly 40 years old. And so you can best reach your sweet spot. Now, if you love people, you can reach all ages. Don't misunderstand me. If you really love people, you can meet people of all ages. But when you're dealing with unbelievers, you will best affect the people who are about 10 years on either side of you. So if you're 30 years old, your sweet spot is people from 20 to 40, okay? And so when I started the church, I was 25 years old. I had to have staff older than me to balance out the church. I had to bring in people who were older than me to balance the church out. Now, as I've gone through all the different decades, I have to add staff younger than me to add it out. And actually, what I've been doing for many years is intentionally building what I call my farm league. And I have an entire percentage of my staffs in their 20s. And then I have an entire staff in their 30s, and I have staff in their 40s, and I have their staff in their 50s. And so when we move up, everybody moves up to the next stage so that people can relate to others. And I have had people on my teaching team who were younger than me. It doesn't bother me if they were more popular with a particular age group. I don't care who you like preaching this church as long as you tithe. You don't have to like me. Just keep coming and tithe and serve. And so if you know who you can reach, then you can add staff on either side of you to reach people like that. As I said, the exception is the missionary gift. And that is, God does give some people the ability to minister to people cross-culturally, and that's a very cool gift that people have. Now, many times, let me talk to those of you who are pastors for just a second. Many times I have met pastors who didn't match either the people in the church or didn't match people in the community, and they're having a hard time ministering because it doesn't match. Like I said when I was the pastor at this church of truckers, when that happens, there's no problem with that. Just move. Go to another church. When the people in a community match the kind of people that are in the church, and the people that are in the community and the church match the kind of person that the pastor is, you have potential for explosive growth. When all three of those line up, the people in the community match the kind of people in the church, and they match the kind of people the pastor is. If any of those are out of whack, growth is possible. I'm telling you, it's possible. It's just more difficult when the pastor doesn't fit. But if there's a major misfit, it's no problem. Just move. There are many towns and many churches I would be an utter failure as a pastor of. Not because they're not good churches, they're great churches. I'm just not that culture. And they would have a hard time with me, and I'd have a hard time with them, and the community would have a hard time with me. The reason this church grew is because I fit here. I fit this community. I fit Southern California. I didn't know it, but I do. And let me give you a couple examples. John Wooster, I don't know if he's here in this service, but he's coming to the conference. John's dear friend that we've sponsored in multiple churches. He's a church planter, planted churches literally all over the world. And in one of the early churches that John planted back in the 80s, John had planted a church in Atlanta, and he was ready to come to California. So I called him up and said, John, we'll sponsor you in a church. Saddleback will sponsor you. And so he came, and he moved out here. He'd grown a church to over 200 people in Atlanta, so I knew he was a good pastor. And he came out here, and he started a brand new church, a Saddleback plant in Irvine. And after about 6-8 months, it was going nowhere. It just wasn't taking off. And so I knew the problem wasn't John. He had a track record. And so I went to John and said, what's the problem? He says, Rick, I don't fit the people here. So what do you mean? He said, well, this part of Irvine is largely middle-aged couples with teenagers. And I said, well, who do you think you can best reach? He said, people like me, young couples with younger kids and even those with strollers. I said, oh, you don't need to be in that part of Irvine. You need to be in Huntington Beach. So we killed the church, moved him 2 cities over to Huntington Beach, started Seabreeze Church there, and within 2 years, the church was running 250. Right guy, wrong place. I got another friend, a dear friend named Dave, African-American pastor in Long Beach. And Dave came to me one day and says, Rick, I've heard you talk about this. I don't fit in my church. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, I've got several advanced degrees. I got a couple of master's degrees, and I speak with a pretty erudite conversation. I'm going, yeah, erudite. Okay, great. Yeah, I get it. I've got a pretty educated vocabulary. And he said, but the church that I pastor, the people in this particular church, just basically have high school degrees. I said, well, Dave, where are the people you want to reach who are educated? And he goes, well, actually, they're about 3 miles down the road, down this road. So it's simple. Resign your church, go 3 miles down the road, and start a church to reach that kind of group. And he went down there and started, and in 2 years, he's running 300 people. Right guy, wrong place. That make sense? So I'm saying to you, when we're talking about this, about who am I best equipped, who does God plan for me to reach, if you don't fit an area, it's not a sin, just get where you fit. But let me tell you this, every one of you, staff member, volunteer, pastor, if God has called you to serve him, and he has called you to serve him, then he has a place where you fit perfectly. Where you fit perfect. And do not give up. Do not give up. He has because he made you for a purpose. Now let me wrap it up with this. What do you do? That's when you don't fit, you can change. What do you do when your church doesn't match the community you're trying to reach? I've seen this happen a lot of times because churches change. When Robert Schuller started the Crystal Cathedral in 1955 in Garden Grove, it was just this lily-white suburban area. Garden Grove is almost 100% Asian, Korean, and Hispanic today. And if you don't speak Korean, you don't speak Hispanic, some of those shops in that city, you're not going to get much help. And all of a sudden, so his community around his church totally changed. What do you do when that happens? What do you do when your church doesn't match the community, the fish who are in the pond now? Well, you've only got 3 options, and let me wrap it up with this. Here are the 3 options you got. If you don't match your community, number 1, build on your strengths. That's one thing you can do. You build on your strengths. Just whatever you do good, go back home and try to do it better. You don't try to be something you're not. If you're a hamburger joint and nobody's buying hamburgers, you don't try to become a Taco Bell. You just figure out a way to make better hamburgers, make them juicier, and learn how to make it better. There are probably still some pockets out there, like the people in your church, because they're obviously there. So that's one option, build on your strength. A second option, when your church doesn't match the community that it's in, is to reinvent your congregation. And what I mean by that is you intentionally change the makeup to match your new target. And you say, this is what we've been in the past, but this is what we're going to become new now. And you intentionally reinvent and completely throw out the old and bring in the new. Now, everybody look up here when you finish writing. This second thing, reinvent the church. I do not advise this. Okay, I do not advise it. You will have inevitable conflict. People will fight you. They will leave the church. You will be vilified as Satan incarnate and the Antichrist. And much blood will be shed, and it will likely be yours, and then you will be martyred. Don't even think about doing this if you've got a church of over 100 people. Unless just God tells you to offer your body as a living sacrifice. Yeah. And he may. And you know what? I actually have some friends who have done this and lived through it, but they are outstanding change management leaders. And you got to be pretty gifted to totally reinvent a church. It can be done, but it's just incredibly hard, and you will be vilified, and blood will be shed. And as I said, don't even think about trying this in a church over 100. However, this is a viable option if you have a very small church. One of the advantages of a small church is a little change can produce major difference in a church. If you got 50 people in your church and you lose 2 families, you get 2 families, that changes the church. So this is a viable option if you have a very small church, 35 people, 45 people. Yeah, you could lose a couple families and gain a couple new families, and the whole makeup is different. That's valuable, and it's one of the values of a few people leaving can transform a church of 50 people. So you can build on your strengths, you can reinvent the congregation, and then here's the third one, and I highly recommend this one. Start new congregations. Start new congregations to reach new groups. If you've got a church full of grandmas, then you say, we need to plant a church to reach your grandkids. They'll understand that. I highly recommend this. And you can do it by adding additional services that are different in style, or you can do it by sponsoring daughter churches, or doing a multi-site that has a different style a little bit like that. That's a legitimate way to start new churches, to reach new congregations, new people groups, new generations. Finally, there on your outline, at the end, what do you do first? Here are your first steps in targeting your community for Christ. Remember, we've just covered one circle, the outward one. How do we go to the community? And we're doing evangelism in the community. We're going to go to worship in the crowd next. What do you do in your community? Here are the first steps you take. First, probe it. You go home and you learn all you can about your area. And you ask questions. You ask all those questions that I gave you in the early part of this study. And then you partition it. You divide your community into people groups. So we got a lot of these, we got a lot of these, we got a lot of these, a lot of these. And then you say, third is prioritize. Which ones do we think we can go after first? Who's under transition? Who's under tension? Who's under change? Who's like what we've already got? And you look and you say, who could we go after first? Who's the most receptive people? Just start with them. And then number 4, you position your church. And you create the kind of church that will speak to that group.